I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. My name is Emma Kami, and I will be your host today as we discuss Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Russia and China's growing Russia-Ukraine engagement. Here with me today is Matthew Orr, a Eurasia Analyst at RANE. Welcome, Matthew.
Hey, Emma. It's a pleasure to be here.
So to start us off, what are the most important takeaways from Xi's visit to Moscow, and what does it say about the trajectory of Russia-China relations?
Yeah, I think overall the visit confirms that these relations are on a trajectory to really continue growing deeper and deeper. And I think a lot of what we saw is an attempt by these two leaders, Xi and Putin, to kind of solidify that trajectory beyond their own presidencies and leaders and leadership of their countries. A lot of it in recent years, prior to the invasion of Ukraine, had been because these two leaders had really kind of built up a very personal rapport between each other over the course of a decade. Being able to meet constantly. They did something like their 40th meeting as leaders of their countries. It's Xi's 8th visit to Russia. But now we saw them sign multiple documents about their desire to really kind of enshrine these high-level contacts as a very normal part of the Russia-Chinese relationship. And I think in general, we're seeing this trajectory where it's clear that China, because of the big power imbalances in the relationship and other reasons, is going to be the one kind of putting the brakes on their further cooperation, trying to control and slow things down and make sure that this relationship is squarely in their favor. Whereas it's going to be Moscow that is trying to really hug itself as tightly as possible to China, and is really becoming more and more dependent on Chinese support. I think by any historical standard, it's clear that historians looking back are going to say that these countries are in an alliance, and they probably have been for some time. But I think both sides are going to really continue to deny that. It's a phrasing or a way to understand the relationship that both sides really, but particularly the Chinese again, is not particularly in their favor and makes them somewhat uncomfortable, not only because of the power imbalance, but also because that would make even higher expectations of the Chinese to support the Russians. And one of the reasons that China doesn't want to do that is that China knows that if it's ever seen to be kind of limiting cooperation or not hugging back as tightly this country that wants to hug China so deeply, then that could cause other countries to question the extent to which aligning themselves so much with China is really in their interests. So I think outwardly, maybe a better way to at least how they're going to frame it is more something like that these countries aren't going to oppose each other on what they do, right? Xi didn't oppose Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example. In fact, quite the opposite. He seemed to indicate that he's sure that the Russian people will support President Putin when he runs again for president in 2024, suggesting that the invasion of Ukraine is something that's particularly praiseworthy and makes the Russian leader even more likely to be widely supported by the Russian people, allegedly in a presidential election. So yeah, in general, I think that it also highlights this power imbalance, because we saw President Putin say that he wants to see the Chinese yuan, the Chinese currency, increasingly popularized in Russia's trade and relations with other countries in the rest of the world. That's quite different than kind of what Putin had wanted at the beginning of his invasion of Ukraine, where he talked about the use of national currencies. He tried to push for more countries to use the ruble. Now, because of sanctions mainly, that idea has really been dropped, and now Russia seems to be endorsing this idea that the Chinese currency needs to be used more in global commerce by many countries, and kind of pushing this idea that the yuan should become a global currency. And that's really going to call even more people to question Russia's independence, and this idea that Russia is its own power center, separate from China.
And what is China's Ukraine peace plan, and how has it been received internationally?
Yeah, so the peace plan is something that was clearly a major topic of conversation at this state visit. Not only in the informal private visit between Putin and Xi the night before the formal meeting, but also at that meeting. It's clear that China is trying to push this doc. It's really a 12-point document. It's being labeled the peace plan. Although that's not really a particularly accurate label, because of course these points don't really get us provide anything that's helpful in ending the conflict, or providing a concrete way to end the war. But it is a way for China to say that diplomatically it is at least thinking about this. It is at least trying to set up a very broad framework for going about how to think about ending the war. And it's an interesting document to look at, as we see as how China tries to use this plan to go abroad and say that it's on the side of peace, etc. The first point of the plan is rather interesting. It talks about how sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all countries must be upheld. Of course, the Ukrainians think that this point essentially recognizes Ukraine's territorial integrity as on paper, as understood by the overwhelming majority of countries around the world, and that essentially that means that Russia should leave all of Ukraine. The problem is that just a few points later, the plan calls for immediate talks and a ceasefire. And it's pretty clear that if something like that takes place, that's an extremely pro-Russian idea, because the Russians, under no circumstances whatsoever, would actually withdraw from what they've seized in Ukraine, and the Chinese know that perfectly well. So the actual purpose of the plan is actually would be presumably to freeze the fighting along the current front line and allow Russia to de facto occupy all of this territory. But the peace plan is still interesting, because even if it doesn't really have a chance of being realized in any meaningful way, it's still something that China can take to the rest of the world, to countries in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, etc., and say, look, we're at least trying to propose a peace, whereas the Americans, the West, are continuing to support Ukraine militarily, and that's actually prolonging the conflict, which is not in your interest. And China seems to think that that's a narrative that can fracture unity within the West regarding support to Ukraine, lead to more calls for a ceasefire and a negotiation, which some political forces in the United States and in Europe, of course, are calling for. So it's a pretty clear attempt to really embolden those forces, and I think it could potentially have some of that effect. So yeah, I think the time, at least a piece of the timing of the visit, is also partially understood by China's peace plan and what it's attempting to do with that plan.
So what exactly is notable about the timing of Xi's visit and China's peace plan? And what do they indicate about the coming months in the Ukraine war?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's probably one of the more unclear or mysterious elements of this visit. There were previous indications that this visit was planned for more like the middle of 2023. Possibly about around May, maybe in April, but then it happened somewhat earlier, at least a few weeks earlier than many people expected. And again, a lot of people tied that to China wanting to push its peace plan, push this idea that it's a potential mediator in the war. Remember that this comes on the back of China actually brokering a fairly notable agreement for Iran and Saudi Arabia to reestablish international relations. And so, right, the idea would be that, China is kind of has a very recent example of its mediation abilities, able to achieve a fairly notable result. And I think that broadly, China and Russia both are comfortable with this idea that China is potentially one of the most likely mediators to an eventual end to the war in Ukraine. If you just look around the world, it's hard to see kind of a particularly good candidate country. At the very beginning of the war, of course, Belarus was a host for talks between Russia and Ukraine, but that didn't really work out, and that's very unlikely as Belarus only becomes more and more and more dependent on Russia, as we've covered on our website. Even a country like Turkey, which brokered the grain deal and has also been a site for Russia-Ukraine negotiations, it's going to be tough for them to maintain their incumbent role as this mediator, because Turkey is of course a NATO member, and it's a pretty substantial supporter of military equipment to Ukraine, armored vehicles, of course the famous drones. And Turkey entirely supports Ukraine's territorial integrity and votes with Ukraine in international bodies, etc. So that's going to make them a tough candidate. Then if you go to places like the Persian Gulf states, it's kind of doubtful that there's any countries in the region that are closely enough tied to both Ukraine and to Russia, and also have the diplomatic heft to really be a super credible mediator. So I mean, you could argue that China really, by process of elimination, is one of the countries that is best positioned to actually eventually at some point play that role. I mean, there's more upcoming things that provide a reason for China or for Xi to make this visit now. The other one is, of course, as you mentioned, the possibility of a Ukrainian counteroffensive. We tend to think that it's pretty likely that the Ukrainians are going to continue to step up offensive operations in the coming weeks and months, and China might want to essentially precede the start of any of those processes. And then, of course, any additional support that it provides to Russia later on as part of Russia's efforts to continue the war and beat back Ukrainian offensives is going to say, well, they're going to say, well, yeah, I mean, we made a much more robust effort at peace at a time when the West wasn't doing so. And right, that didn't go anywhere because the West, failed to take it seriously and failed to respond, and we did what we could, etc. So there's kind of narrative reasons that China, or rhetorical reasons that China would want to do that. And then the last one that comes to mind is that there's this upcoming Summit for Democracy, which is one of the Biden administration's major foreign policy initiatives, and of course China and Russia both see that whole initiative as targeted at them, as basically as building the foundations for an international coalition, a much broader coalition to oppose Russia and China as authoritarian states in their coalition on the world stage. And the Chinese may think that their position on Ukraine and their ability to bring up this topic beforehand could somewhat fracture the unity of the participants in that summit on the question on military support for Ukraine, continuation of the war, etc. But I mean, and there's even more potential points. But the bottom line is that the timing is definitely notable and interesting, and may open more questions than provide answers.
Thank you very much for that analysis, Matthew. You can learn how geopolitical events like this could affect your business with RANE Intelligence Briefs. Our flagship risk intelligence products provide clients with access to the insights and analyses they need to make more informed decisions and drive better risk management outcomes, all for a fraction of the cost you pay yourself. Sign up at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. I'm Emma Kami. Thank you for listening.